Sociology Robot. Hello and welcome to the 8th video lecture on OCR A Level Sociology, Paper 1, looking at subcultures and cultural hybridity. Before we get into these two topics, let's take a look at another idea which isn't mentioned in the specification, but it's quite important for you to understand. This is dominant culture. For functionalists, dominant culture would be the traditional national culture of Britishness and its values. Functionalists, of course, believe that it's very important for us to have shared values, and they think that the dominant British culture provides this. A similar idea that we've already come across is the concept of light culture, the official culture that immigrants have to assimilate into, perhaps by passing some sort of Britishness test. In America, there's the related idea of the melting pot, the majority culture that immigrants are expected to join in and become a part of. Not everybody agrees with this concept of the dominant culture. Marxists prefer to call it the hegemonic culture and point out that this culture is really shaped by ruling class ideology and it's full of capitalist values, and we shouldn't go along with it. Subcultures, then, can be understood as groups that share some of the norms and values of the dominant culture, but have different norms and values in other ways. For example, there are religious or ethnic subcultures. Sikhs might be a good example. Sikh men are noticeable because of the distinctive turban that they wear. There are subcultures based on popular culture, for example, music and fashion. A particularly noticeable one is the goth subculture, with its delight in old-fashioned clothing and an interest in vampires, ghosts, and the supernatural. Then there are subcultures based around lifestyles or ethical or political positions, like, for example, veganism. Cultural hybridity is slightly different. It's the mixing or blending of cultures. It's often pointed out that second or third generation immigrants will end up mixing their family culture with the dominant culture that they have grown up around. Anthony Giddens, a sociologist we've already come across, refers to reverse colonialism, the tendency of, for example, cultures that the British Empire colonised in the 19th century to start to influence British culture itself in the other direction. Cultural hybridity can express itself in a number of ways, for example, being bilingual, speaking English, but also your own traditional language. We can see it in mixing of dress codes and hairstyles, for example, white people with dreadlocks. Combining foods, fusion cuisine mixes European or American with Asian recipes. An interesting example of this cultural hybridity in food is the role that curry has in British popular culture. The dish chicken tikka masala was the most popular British curry for a long time and briefly the most popular British dinner. But it doesn't come from India. It appears to have been invented in Scotland by Punjabi chefs thinking up a new recipe that would appeal to British customers. Let's take a little look at AO2, the application of these ideas, and the experience of British Asians. Now, there's a great study by Joel and Baines, 1998, who look at second and third generation British Asians who they say have a dual identity, both British and Asian. They use the term Brasians to describe these people. And the interesting phrase of a white mask, that British Asians can adopt a white culture when amongst the dominant culture, and then they can put this aside and embrace their traditional culture at home. This is known as code switching. Joel and Baines also point out that particularly third generation Brasians are drawn to a hyper-ethnic style, exaggerating certain aspects of their own traditional ethnic culture. They call this empowerment through difference and argue it's a way of coping with racism. Examples might be Bhangra music, which mixes traditional Indian music with modern pop, Asian rap, and of course Bollywood films, the Indian film industry with its very distinctive music, dance and costume. Is there a key scholar we can look at on these topics? Well, let me introduce you to Sarah Thornton, a Canadian sociologist who was very active in Britain in the 1990s, and whose main focus is on art. Thornton wrote the book Club Cultures in 1995, looking at the dance subculture amongst young people in Britain. She takes Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital that we've already looked at, and extends this with the notion of subcultural capital. And if cultural capital is knowing about Shakespeare and high art and classical music, subcultural capital is knowing the latest bands, where you can find the best gigs and who the up-and-coming DJs are, what's hot and what's not. Thornton calls this the dynamics of hipness. And she thinks it's born out of a sort of resistance to consumer culture. Thornton argues that consumer culture is deeply inauthentic. It doesn't truly satisfy anybody. This means it's going to produce alienation if you're a Marxist, or anomie if you're a functionalist. But Thornton argues that people value underground or non-mainstream culture for its authenticity, and having a knowledge of this non-mainstream culture is subcultural capital. How can we evaluate these ideas? Well, subcultures can be viewed quite positively. For Marxists and for many feminists, subcultures are important because they express resistance to the hegemonic culture. Subcultures are on some level not going along with the dominant culture. There are criticisms though. For example, functionalists are concerned that by joining a subculture, you're cutting yourself off from shared values, and this can lead to anomie, and it might not be a coincidence then that there are subcultures that involve themselves in crime, drugs, and various dysfunctional behaviours. Cultural hybridity can be viewed positively as well. It, of course, adds to diversity. It's fresh and new, and it revitalises the dominant culture by bringing new elements into it. Marxists and some feminists would go a bit further. They would say the important thing about cultural hybridity is that it actually undermines hegemonic culture. It gives a voice to the non-white, non-European, non-middle class members of society. And this is precisely what concerns some functionalists, who would point out that cultural hybridity dilutes or undermines our national identity and our shared values. It makes us less respectful of our own traditional culture. Another negative view of cultural hybridity is that it can lead to cultural appropriation. Now, this is the idea of taking aspects from another culture, but doing so very thoughtlessly and based on your own unearned privilege. A particularly striking example of this came about in 2018 when a big argument blew up on the internet when an American schoolgirl posted pictures of herself in her prom dress that she had found at what the Americans call a thrift store, a second-hand shop. Now, the prom dress was a traditional Chinese dress. She went to the prom with it, she was a bit of a sensation there, took some photographs, but when these turned up online, she was criticised by a Chinese American who said, "That's my culture, not your prom dress." In other words, she didn't really have the right to go around dressed like that, because that look belongs to another culture, not hers. This argument has resurfaced again more recently with the sports team, the Exeter Chiefs, whose fans have for years turned up to matches wearing Native American headdress. There's a campaign to try and stop them doing that, arguing that it's disrespectful for Native Americans, whose culture that's a part of. A related debate about cultural hybridity is whether it's acceptable for actors to play characters from a different ethnicity. Recently, the Disney live-action version of Mulan drew a lot of attention by casting Chinese actors in the main roles. Cultural hybridity is of course linked to global culture. It's a product of immigration and the ethnic subcultures that creates. We've already seen that second and third generation immigrants are the most likely to adopt cultural hybridity, and that reverse colonialism is another explanation of the widespread hybridity in culture at the moment. This also links to popular culture. Subcultures often form around fashion and music. Some subcultures can gain a lot of status through this. Think about the way RuPaul's TV show has elevated the status of the drag queen culture. Not all cultures gain this sort of prestige, though. Some cultures are stereotyped and trivialized on TV. For example, the debate about the Indian character Apu in The Simpsons. Let's sum up. Subcultures share some norms and values with the dominant culture, but they differ in other ways. They might be seen as resisting dominant culture, but they also might be seen as producing anomie. Hybridity means mixing the norms of different cultures. This is linked to immigration, and again it might be seen as immigrant groups resisting dominant culture, or refreshing dominant culture with their new ideas. It's raised the problem of cultural appropriation. We've looked at research by Joel and Baines, 1998, into British Asians or Brasians adopting a white mask and adopting a hyper-ethnic style. And we've looked in a bit of detail at Thornton's 1995 book on dance culture and the concept of subcultural capital, which is people searching for authenticity within popular and consumer culture. Let's finish off with some exam questions. You should be used now to these 6 mark questions. Explain using examples the concept of subcultures, and explain using examples the concept of cultural hybridity. Question number 2 will always give you 2 sources, usually a picture and a short passage of writing. This one on the celebrity chef Nadia Hussain. A question might be, using sources A and B and your wider sociological knowledge, explain the concept of cultural hybridity. You can say what you see in the picture, and we've got Nadia there wearing traditional head covering for a Muslim woman, yet also a t-shirt and a woolly cardigan, and she's presenting a dish as a mainstream TV presenter in a very conventional looking British kitchen. You can go through source B and pick out details that illustrate cultural hybridity. On the dominant culture side, you've got Nadia as the winner of a reality TV show after baking a big fat wedding cake and loving fish fingers and learning to cook recipes off the internet and being awarded the MBE. But she's also a Muslim, married her husband in a traditional ceremony. It was an arranged marriage. And you can see a sort of cultural hybridity in the blending of things like her fish finger lasagna and her second marriage, which mixes the British concept of a marriage for love with the Bangladeshi concept of an arranged marriage. Question 3 is the 20-mark essay question. Here's one: outline and briefly evaluate the view that cultural hybridity adds to the diversity in society. And you need to make three arguments. You could argue that it does. You could use examples of people like Nadia Hussein and talk about the new ideas, new music, new fashion that cultural hybridity produces. But you could also question that with the danger of cultural appropriation. And you could argue that it does not add to the diversity of society. Functionists might argue that it dilutes our traditional culture and produces anomie. And you could bring in the Marxist view that cultural hybridity expresses resistance to hegemonic culture. The second question, outline and briefly evaluate the view that subcultures are harmful, would be tackled in a similar way. You could argue that they are harmful if they produce anomie, that they are not harmful if they enable people to pursue authenticity, as Sarah Thornton points out, and you could have the kind of mixed view that they express resistance to hegemonic culture, which might be disruptive, but Marxists would argue is good for us all in the long run. I hope that's been helpful. You can find more about culture in my study guide Socialisation, Culture and Identity, or the combined study guide with youth subcultures. Both are available on Amazon, and you can find a link in the description below. Sociology Robot.